Good morning, or afternoon, or evening, depending on when you decide to watch this. I am Anchor, and you're watching the Krytan Chronicler. And today we're going to meet a new role player. This is Zelara. I'm very excited because this is a Sylvari character, and apart from a very brief encounter with a Sylvari in episode 3, this is really the first time we've had a chance to meet a role player from this race. So what's happening here is Eckhart and this other character actually just sort of hopped into a dynamic event going on in the area, which is the escort of this big pack mule. I think it's called a Marmox. I can't remember what they're called, but basically just escorting supplies. And
Hold it.
Surprise!
Give us your cargo, or we blow the bridge.
If
we
you blow the
get
bridge,
interrupted.
there won't be anything left to take. You're bluffing.
Bad move. You had your chance. You said it would take out the whole crew. Well, we're in it now. Attack!
And so just another example of why it's a lot of fun to roleplay with the dynamic events. You never really know what's going to happen. Unless you've done the event before, then you probably have a good idea. But even then, I mean, dynamic events can go, as far as I know, at least one or two ways, depending on if you fail or succeed or how well you succeed. So right here, we were just escorting this this caravan and got attacked on the bridge, right in the middle of our conversation, just as we were starting to roleplay with each other. So it was a good introduction to this character, because Eckhart gets to see right off the bat that this is, you know, the armor she's wearing isn't just decorative. She really is a warrior, and he uses that to his advantage later on. So now they're just going to sort of introduce themselves a little bit, and I'm going to chime in here and again, but mostly I want you guys to learn what Zelara is all about and what her character really means to the story.
Huh?
And so right here, we're basically just hopscotching from one dynamic event to another, which is a great way to move things along. If it ever gets stale, if you're ever having a conversation with someone, but you just don't know what to say, or you don't really know where you want the story to go, and it's starting to get a bit awkward, then always just jump into another dynamic event, or use the scenery to your advantage. I mean, if you look around, there's lots of caves and places to explore, so you could always use that to move your story along and move it to the next plot point, in a sense. And the interesting thing about role-playing is it is a story, but doesn't necessarily need a plot. It's more like you're seeing moments from a person's life, and you're kind of living out that life. And so some people like to plan out big elaborate stories with really interesting plots and plot twists and all these things. So for something like that, you would really need to coordinate with the people you're role-playing with, because they have to know what's going on. You don't want it to go off on a tangent and get lost in the plot like some actual movies do. You hopefully want it to be a bit more cohesive like that if you are trying to tell a story. That's not exactly what we're trying to do here. I mean, what I try to do when I'm role-playing with different people is kind of push it in a story-like direction, but it doesn't have to. Really, it's just about the characters, most of all, and getting to know the characters and telling their stories, because there's a story behind every character that you meet when you're role-playing. I think that's a reason a lot of people like getting into role-playing, is because they're storytellers, and when they create a character, they like the challenge of coming up with a story behind them and figuring out, you know, what their motivations are and how they got to where they are. And that's kind of what we're going to figure out about Zelara here, just as Eckhart, you know, it's the aftermath of the battle in Lion's Arch. I mean, the battle's still technically going on, but Eckhart has decided his efforts are best spent elsewhere in the world by helping the survivors rebuild you know, hopefully once the fighting's done, you know, they're going to want to start rebuilding Lion's Arch, so he thought he'd pitch in by looking for resources. And again, that's not a real quest in the game. That's something I just made up as an excuse to adventure out in the world and hopefully meet other role players. So now, of course, Eckhart, he's had the opportunity to see Zelara in battle. And so Eckhart has decided if, you know, she has some skill with a blade, so it makes sense if he's going to go into dangerous territory, then if she's available, then he'd use her help, obviously. And as he's explaining, you know, to rebuild Lion's Arch, they're going to need a lot more than just food. They're going to need, you know, supplies and materials and minerals, like lumber and iron and all these things. So his plan is to just go exploring to try and find any resources in the game. And this is me taking another dynamic of the game, another game mechanic, and using it to my advantage for the story, because, you know, just like in virtually every MMORPG, there is lots of resource collection and crafting. So I thought I'd incorporate that into the story a little by actually using those materials and those resources as a plot device, basically. And so yeah, as I was saying, you can, you know, create a much more elaborate plot with, you know, villains and betrayals and all that, but if you're just spontaneously jumping into a roleplay like I am with Zelara, I mean, I didn't know this character at all. I basically just ran into them right before the video started as we jumped into this dynamic event. So for something like that, you can't really get too complicated, because then the other person will feel like they're just along for the ride and they don't really have an invested part in the story, like they're really that significant. And it's really just you telling a story and they're watching. And I mean, if it's a really good story, that's great, but kind of defeats the purpose of role-playing. You want to feel like you're included and that it's interactive. So I wanted to make something simple so that I'd have a chance to get to know this character and figure out what she was doing in the area or why she came to Lion's Arch. And while at the same time, you know, having some fun playing the game and, you know, exploring a lot more. And so here, Eckhart's going to try and get to know a bit more about, you know, why she was in Lion's Arch or what she's doing in the area. So he's going to quiz her a little bit here. Now, I was really impressed that Zelara had an answer ready for me when I asked, you know, what she was doing in Lion's Arch or if she was living there. And so it was clear that she had thought about, you know, or this player had thought about, you know, what his or her character was doing there and what their in-story and in-character reasons for being there were. Because, I mean, a lot of the time, role players will take a break from role-playing just to, you know, play through these big events or these story missions just because they like playing the game. You know, they just want to get the experience points or they want to get the achievements, and their character might not necessarily have a reason for doing it, so they'll step out of character and kind of step out of the story and just play it as a regular game. So, you know, I thought maybe that was the case, that, you know, this player just went to Lion's Arch for fun, basically. But I like that the player had thought of a realistic reason for their character to be there. As they mentioned, Zelara was escorting saplings, and if you don't know anything about the Sylvari culture, saplings are basically what they call their newly awakened. I guess you could say newborn, but they're not really born so much as grown, as they are a very plant-like race. But she was escorting these new saplings who are new to the world, showing them Lion's Arch, and right then the attack happened, and so a lot of her companions died. So yeah, there's definitely a dark side to this character's story, and it's nice because you see that the story of this character is continuing to evolve. I mean, it's not just a backstory that they created when they did their character creation. You know, you want your character's story to continue as much as possible. And I mean, a lot of people, when they create a character, as far as I've noticed, a lot of their character's story will take place in the past. So they'll have a lot of backstory, pages and pages of backstory of, you know, how, you know, their parents were killed when they were young, and then they joined a band of misfits, and then from there they went to the army, and all this multiple things happening in their backstory. But that's not things that they actually role-played. That's just story that they had imagined before they started role-playing to kind of flesh out their character, which is great. I mean, the more backstory your character has, you know, the more you have to draw on in terms of, you know, their motivations and the depth of their character. It makes for a much more deeper character when you have a big backstory. But the problem with what a lot of people run into is they'll create this huge backstory, but then that'll be the beginning, middle, and end of their character's journey. You know, nothing really happens after they start role-playing. They're kind of stuck in the past and always referring to things that go on or had gone on in their backstory, and not really letting their life move forward. You want your character to kind of go in different directions, and you want their story to evolve in new ways. And you don't want it to constantly be like, oh, I'm trying to avenge my father. You know, if everything you do is based on something that happened in the past, then, you know, it doesn't make for a very interesting character. And more importantly, it's harder to interact with a character like that, because their story is kind of already defined. And so if I want to jump in and roleplay with you, but I don't really have a place to fit into your well thought out story, then it kind of leaves me out of the fun, you know, and I don't really have a way to interact with you. So again, you got to be careful. You want a good backstory. I mean, it's not necessary, but it'll make your character seem a lot deeper. But you also have to make sure that your character continues to grow and do new things that aren't necessarily related or dependent on the things that happened in the past. And so I really like that Zelara had incorporated the living story into her character by, you know, giving her this new quest, basically, to escort these saplings, and now the saplings have been killed in the battle, and she's kind of lost. As she kind of explained, after the death of her companions, it kind of left her without, you know, meaning or direction, and kind of left her wandering, you know, not really knowing where to go next. As you can imagine, you know, any character in a situation like that would feel after such a really devastating moment in their lives. And so, yeah, I really love that she incorporated that into her story, but at the same time, she definitely has a more elaborate backstory even before the Battle of Lion's Arch that hopefully we'll get to know a little bit about as Eckhart talks to her a bit more. And so, yeah, it's a very dark story, very dark motivations for this character, but I thought it was great. It was a great motivation for her to push her story in a new direction, because now, you know, she has a purpose. Her companions were killed by Scarlet, as Eckhart is explaining here. So, yeah, and the fact that Scarlet is also Sylvari probably hit her close to home as well. And so Eckhart's just quizzing her a little bit about Sylvari culture, asking about the Nightmare Court.
I think that's a marvelous idea.
And not only Eckhart, but myself included,
married.
we didn't really know much about Sylvari. I mean, I've never played as a Sylvari.
I'll never tire of you.
And
even centaurs can't come between us.
I mean, I know a little bit about the lore. You know, I've watched a few videos and read some of the wikis. But still, because I hadn't actually played as a Sylvari, I didn't have that inside perspective. And I kind of did that intentionally. I mean, part of me was tempted to just try out all the races just to see what they're like. But because I was playing a human character that didn't know about all these things and was very curious about all these things, I wanted Eckhart's curiosity to feel very genuine and reflect my own curiosity. So, you know, it was, again, kind of the reason why I like to play characters that are very similar to myself, because it makes it a lot more convincing when I'm role-playing. I don't have to really get into character. I can kind of just jump on my computer and I'm Eckhart. It's pretty easy. And so yeah, it's nice also that despite her very dark circumstances, Zelara still has a nice bitter sense of humor. And here, they're actually kind of discussing a bit of the lore a little bit, referring to Ventari's teachings. Again, that's another big part of Sylvari culture. If you're not familiar, the Ventari tablet, I believe it's called, is basically the doctrine that most Sylvari live by. Although, interestingly enough, as Eckhart's explaining here, as he well knows, Ventari was a centaur. And they're actually walking into centaur territory, hostile centaur territory. And it was a really nice segue, because here we're talking about a centaur who, you know, came up with this doctrine about how to live peacefully and live with wisdom and to live a full and good life. And yet, as they're talking about this, they're walking into a very different tribe of centaur that are very much a warrior tribe that are bent on reclaiming their territory and driving out the human race from their area. And so yeah, it was interesting that we had that segue. Again, totally not intentional, or I mean not planned in any case, but it was a nice spontaneous connection. And that's one of the great things about Guild Wars 2's lore, is that none of it feels random. It really feels like it's a living world with a very rich history, and everything is interconnected and interwoven. You have the humans battling the centaur, and then you have centaur, you know, basically teaching the Sylvari, and then you have the Sylvari who are getting abducted by, you know, members of the Asura, and everything is really interwoven and interconnected. It's not just separate factions doing their own thing. And it leads to a lot of really interesting discussions, like the ones Eckhart and Zelara are having about how, you know, every race seems to have its own inner conflict. No race seems to be free of the kind of conflict that goes on between people. And if you didn't see the previous episode and you're wondering what the orange text is in the chat box, that is the guild chat. And as I mentioned before, since Eckhart is now part of the Tyrian Adventure League, they actually do their guild chat in character. So those characters that you see in the chat box, those are actual characters. It's not just the player, you know, speaking out of character. It's really intentional in the voice of their character. And so you can just ignore it. Sometimes, you know, I like to pretend that Eckhart kind of has it on, you know, silent or mute mode, because he's not necessarily focused on what his guildmates are talking about when he's in the middle of a roleplay. But at the same time, you can, if you pay attention to the chat box, you can occasionally see some pretty funny and interesting conversations going on. And what Eckhart's referring to here is it's a very Sylvari cultural thing that they have, and that from the moment they're not really born, but from the moment that they wake up, a lot of them have this vocation, this purpose in life that sometimes it's vague, it's pretty vague, but they know that there's this mission, or a wild hunt, as they call it, that they have to accomplish. And so Eckhart's just very curious about that, because as a human, you know, it's a very alien concept. I mean, even though the humans do have their gods and they do have a strong sense of faith, there's also a sense of, you know, creating your own destiny and having, you know, control over your life. Whereas the Sylvari kind of embrace the concept of destiny and having a wild hunt, because they're all born with this sense of purpose. And basically, to explain a little bit of detail, when they're created, their first stage of life takes place in what's called the dream. And so the dream is kind of their childhood, you could say. That's where they learn all about Tyria. They have this dream that simulates the world, but it's not exactly like what Tyria is like. It just gives them an idea of what's to expect when they wake up. But during their dream, they receive this wild hunt, which is basically like a call to action. And it's very cryptic and very vague, but it kind of gives them a direction so that when they wake up, they have a sense of purpose, of a mission that they have to accomplish. And so Eckart's kind of getting to know a bit about Zelarna's wild hunt and, you know, what she plans to do with her life. And so that's something very interesting if you're creating a Sylvari character. It's definitely an interesting thing to work into your backstory. Your wild hunt will definitely be a big part of your character. You know, unless you want to play an atypical Sylvari, which is okay. But most Sylvari, their wild hunt will play a big part of their character story. And again, for Eckhart, backstory wasn't a very important part for me, because when I roleplay, I like most of the story to happen after I finish making my character. You know, I want the story to really begin the moment my character walks out into the world. And so Eckhart, for him, I didn't really come up with much of a backstory. I mean, in the first episode, all that I really knew about him was, you know, he's from Krytan, he's an apprentice engineer, and he's out trying to complete his apprenticeship while exploring the world. And so that was really all I needed. And from there, I kind of, you know, made up little tiny details as I went along. You know, if somebody asked me, you know, about my parents or whether my parents were alive, then I would come up with that. Or if they asked me, you know, if I always wanted to be an engineer, you know, then I'd slowly, as I'm playing, kind of put bits and pieces together of Eckhart while I'm playing. And it's not that hard to do. I mean, if you ever remember, like, playing with toys as a kid or dolls as a kid, even though you're the one that's making everything up, you know, when you're playing with these toys, at the same time, you're kind of making it up as you go. It's make-believe, right? So even though you're making it up, you kind of also at the same time get the joy of surprising yourself in a way. That was one of the most interesting things when I look back on, you know, my days as a kid playing with little Lego people, was the fact that even though I was the one, you know, talking in all their little voices and playing with them, I still felt like I didn't know what was gonna happen, you know, like, oh, what's Lego Man gonna do? How's he gonna survive this melting pit of lava? You know, it was exciting. And that's kind of a similar feeling now when I'm playing with Eckhart. Is I still don't really know what he's gonna do, and I don't know. I'm discovering his character as I play, really. So I'm discovering, you know, how he feels about certain issues. Like, how does he feel about the centaur? Well, you know, obviously he's fearful of them. They're very dangerous. But, you know, has a wider understanding. You know, he talks about Ventari and how Ventari is very peaceful. So, you know, yeah, he's afraid of them, but at the same time has a fascination for them. And so that's something, again, that I just sort of realized as I was playing. I didn't sit down and have to decide all these things beforehand. You kind of, if you don't want to, you can still figure it out as you go on. And yeah, it's incredibly fun that way because you can surprise yourself. And one of the many joys of role-playing, for sure. And yet another reason I love role-playing while exploring is you get to see your characters be really badass sometimes, like Zelara was right there. And yeah, it's another great reason when you're role-playing out in the world. It's a great reason to do that because if you're creating this, you know, I'm Zoltor the Brave with my legendary warhammer and I smite my foes, you know, you can create like this really badass character. But if you're just role-playing in a tavern all the time, then you're never actually gonna see, you know, the part that makes your character really badass, you know? You never actually get to see that major part of your character. Same thing if you're playing like a magic user. If magic is really an important part of your character, then hopefully at some point you're going to want to see your character actually using magic, you know, in a very significant way. And same thing with Eckhart, you know, he's an engineer. He might just be an apprentice, but he still, you know, knows a thing or two about building turrets and explosives and all that. So it's part of the role-playing to actually see him do what he does best. Armored up. So you only get that when you're actually, I believe what it's called is adventure role-playing, when you're doing PvE and doing dynamic events. But role-playing in taverns, not to bash that is a lot of fun as well. As long as you get out and stretch your legs, your virtual legs, every once in a while. And here I use another common technique that I like to use when I'm role-playing, which is I basically ask a question while giving a suggestion for the answer at the same time. And what that means basically is, even though, I mean, we've established that Zelara, or rather this player, has come up with a fairly in-depth backstory for this character. I mean, they're definitely not new to role-playing. They know what they're doing. But at the same time, just because you have a backstory doesn't mean that you have an answer to every question in terms of what your character has done or what they do with their lives, you know? Some people are just casual role-players. They just do it every now and then. They don't have pages of backstory written. So I try to avoid awkward situations where I ask a question and the player's just like, I don't know. I don't know what my uncle does for a living, you know? You can kind of put them on a spot that way. So what I like to do, just to be safe, is just in case they don't have an answer ready, I will ask a question, but like I'll also give a suggestion at the same time. So what Eckhart did there, he's like, oh, are you one of the Sylvari wardens? So he's basically asking you, you know, what do you do with your life? While at the same time, you know, this player doesn't want to be like, well, I don't know, I just adventure and go on quests and slay things. You know, they want to have a realistic kind of job for their character. But in case they haven't, you know, role-played that or developed that, then it's gonna be a bit awkward. And it can be a lot more risky. I mean, obviously this character has a much more decided and realized story, but it can be awkward, you know, if you ask for very specific details, like what did you eat for breakfast this morning? I mean, if it's something really that they might not have come up with, then you can kind of put them on the spot. So it's good to just kind of plug a little suggestion so that if they don't have an answer ready, but it's not too important to their character, then yeah, then they can just sort of take your suggestion and go with that. And so he was asking about the wardens and the Nightmare Court, and getting to know that so she does indeed have a bit of a backstory. And I'm actually not sure if this friend she's referring to is just a character she made up, or if it's an actual role player that, you know, this is a story that these players have come up with, you know, on different occasions. And so, or it could be a combination of both. You know, it could be a combination of things that they've actually discussed in character, and it could also be things that just happen, you know, behind the scenes that they've discussed maybe out of character or over forums, or set up a story outside of the game. And similar to what I did with Eckhart, you know, when earlier he's talking about he lost a friend, or rather a teacher, in Lion's Arch. You know, that wasn't actually a real player. That was just a character that I made up, basically an NPC, you would call them, a non-player character. Just to give him more of a story of what he was doing in Lion's Arch. You know, he wasn't just wandering around killing time. He actually did have people he was meeting and working with. And so, and also to give him, you know, a bit more of a connection to what was going on. You know, even though he's not from Lion's Arch, he did have friends there that he lost during the battle, so it is still very personal to him. And so I like that Zelara had this other story worked out. You know, it wasn't just she's a warden, but she's a warden with a very interesting dilemma on her hands. And so what we're doing now isn't really relevant to the plot, per se, but again, I am a gamer as well as a role player. I do like to get all the achievements and everything, but I didn't want to just, you know, break from the story and break our immersion by saying, you know, out of character, like, oh, hey, do you mind if we go and get this viewpoint? I still wanted everything to feel like it was part of the story that was going on between these two characters. So I thought, okay, they're looking for resources. There's a obvious vantage point up on top of these rocks. So I'll kill two birds with one stone. I'll just say I'll get the achievement, or the viewpoint as it's called, and at the same time Eckhart can actually use that vantage point to survey the area for any resources. And yeah, that's the great thing about, I mean, I don't know if it's true for all MMORPGs, but certainly for this one, you can really get away with role-playing non-stop. Like, even that little moment there where Zelara was having trouble climbing up on the rocks, you know, what was really going on is, because of the polygons and the way that the map is set up, you know, her character couldn't physically jump high enough to get onto the rocks. But for role-playing purposes, it was just, you know, we just sort of made up the reason she couldn't get up, because the rocks were too steep. And so we were basically giving each other hints of how to get up to this point in the game without breaking character. We were doing it all in character. You know, Eckhart's just saying, you know, the rocks are a little less steep on this side, but what I was really saying was, you know, this seems to be what the programmers put, you know, the direction that the programmers want us to go in order to get up here. So yeah, you can get away all the time just staying in character and still enjoy the game and not have to, you know, get too confused at all.
This rose has thorns. Here they are.
Refreshing. strong.
Fury rising! I'm fast as the
Well,
wind.
that is usually a lot more consistent combat than I will show in one of these episodes. You usually like to focus on, you know, the dialogue aspects of role-playing, but I just wanted to show what a crazy battle that was, because that was actually a lot longer than what you saw there. It was a pretty long and very intense battle, and a great example of the danger that the characters face in the world, because I know it can seem like in some of these other episodes like it's a bit of a walk in the park, especially if you're traveling with a party. You know, some of the enemies aren't that too difficult to deal with, but this is a good reminder that there really is serious danger in the world of Tyrion. That's exactly why he needs other adventurers like Zelara in order to go through these areas and explore. Because, to be honest, I mean, coming from a player, you know, like a serious, I consider myself a pretty serious gamer, but I would not have been able to handle that by myself without Zelara. So not only Eckhart, but even me as a player, I needed this help through this part of the game. I probably would not have survived. So it's another great way the game creates excuses for you to team up, because challenging battles like that are way more fun when you have a party together, and even more fun when you're role-playing, because if you're just a couple of dudes, I've said this before, but if you're just a couple of dudes or lasses sitting behind your computer type pressing in keys on your keyboard, you know, it's not as dire a circumstance as if you're actually two people fighting for their lives, and you only get that sense of urgency when you're role-playing.
Yeah. Strong.
Now, as I've mentioned in the past, there can be a lot of different ways to connect with role players, but this will always be my favorite way, because it's the most unexpected way. And you know, these role players that I'm meeting through these different spontaneous encounters, you know, I do add them to my friends list. I do, you know, connect with them over and over again. And, you know, it doesn't necessarily have to be something that you schedule or set up, because if you're just running into someone, you know, they're already online. You don't have to wait for when your schedules are aligned so that you both have free time. You just run into someone on the fly and start role-playing with them right then and there. But for story purposes, it frees you up to meet so many more characters, and by meeting more characters, it makes your own character, it gives your own character more depth. You know, it enhances their story, because by meeting Zelara, now Eckhart has so much more perspective on Sylvari as a race, because he's met a real Sylvari. It's not just, you know, something he read in a book. And so, you know, moving forward, that'll definitely inform, you know, his opinions about Sylvari and his understanding of their race. So when you meet people this way, you can kind of take your story in unexpected directions, as opposed to if you are, you know, planning everything out and writing out a story and then just acting it out. So I'll always prefer this way, but of course there are other ways to meet people. You can go on the forums, as I mentioned before. You could always just type in the area chat, which basically broadcasts a message to everyone in the area and hope that there's some role players listening. Although personally, I usually have area chat turned off. So if you're trying to ask me a question in area chat and I ignore you, it's not personal, I promise. But of course, yeah, that's one way to do it. And friends. If you have friends who play the game, I mean, you'd be surprised how many people are interested in at least trying role-playing. I mean, if you're a role player but you just don't know a lot of other role players, then yeah, get your friends involved, because that's usually how most people get involved in role-playing, is they just know someone who asks them to try it out. So that can be a great way to get more people involved. In fact, I insist that you do it. If they're not sure whether it's for them or not, then you could always pass this video along to them, and hopefully that'll give them an idea of what role-playing really is. But yeah, ask any of your friends to role-play. It's okay if you don't really know what you're doing, because there's no right or wrong. That's the important thing about role-playing, is, you know, you don't have to worry about whether or not you'll get penalized for, you know, saying something out of character. It's mostly for the fun of it, you know, and having an immersive experience. And you get really interesting experiences that you wouldn't have just playing the game normally. Like all of this, I could have missed all of these events if I hadn't been role-playing with Zelara. So it's definitely a good thing to consider. And if you ever need any tips for how to meet other role players in the game, or like things to say to other characters, like if you're not sure how to get role-playing started, then yeah, ask all sorts of questions in the comments. I'd like to have a lot more discussion about role-playing and kind of the art, if you could say so, about role-playing. So yeah, ask any questions you have in the comments and I'll try and answer them. But hopefully the videos themselves have been informative enough. And now things are about to wrap up right here. They're just in this town that's currently under attack by Centaur. So Centaur are definitely the villains of this episode, you could say. So even though we thwarted that boss battle, it makes you wonder, you know, what would have happened if we had failed, because these dynamic events can go in a number of different directions if you don't successfully complete them. For instance, if we don't stop the Centaur from taking over this town, then the town will end up being occupied by Centaur until, you know, a powerful enough group is able to come in and take them out.
Show Melandru your remorse. We must lift our voices and plead them to return.
Yeah, I like the fact that this guy is preaching the end of the world as they're getting attacked. He's not very helpful there. But as I was saying, yeah, so it made me wonder, you know, if we hadn't have defeated that boss earlier, you know, would it have affected this battle or affected another battle? So it really makes you feel like the things you do in the world matter. So things are just wrapping up here as they're on their way back to Lion's Arch. Luckily, Eckhart was able to get at least a few supplies to donate to the Lion's Arch relief effort. And so as they leave town and head back to Lion's Arch, I do want to let you guys know about the Guild Wars 2 Tumblr. Just in case you haven't, for some reason, checked it out yet, I highly recommend that you go there, because it is like paradise for Guild Wars 2 fans. There's so many different fan-made content, like crafts and costumes and short stories and tons of fan-generated content for you to feast your eyes on. And I remember like saying in an earlier episode, like, that's exactly what I was looking for. You know,
Welcome.
I love seeing different people's take on Guild Wars and their
You really wallop the centaurs. Someday,
different people's
that
creativity
was
coming out.
spectacular. You really wallop the centaurs.
So
Someday,
you should
I
definitely check it out.
like
I
you.
should also mention that the Krytan Chronicler was featured on the Guild Wars 2 Tumblr, so I was very grateful to ArenaNet and to the Guild Wars 2 Tumblr team for sharing the video. I'm got my fingers crossed that they'll let me get away with posting another episode. But even if not, you should still check it out. It's a great place to see other fan-generated content and also share your own. If you have any short stories or if you have your own character Tumblr, really anything seems to be acceptable there, you know, as long as it's appropriate, of course. So you should try submitting some of your own stuff. I'll leave the link to the Tumblr below the video, and hopefully you can check it out sometime after watching this. Other than that, things are just gonna wrap up here as they walk back to the destruction that is Lion's Arch. I hope you've enjoyed the episode. There are many more episodes to come, and just remember to keep on role-playing. This is your host, Anchor, signing out.
What? Make it quick.
Do you require my assistance?